organization that bothers me. Just some of my other teams
Right,
are
nice to meet
so easy to see what's going on.
You're not.
So I don't know, kind of 50.
No, I'm just finishing a contract in Scott.
Oh, are you?
These are my
Yeah.
favorite things because I'm used
No,
to like
merch.
more tech writers.
I've done everything, now I've done
like
merch.
this, or this
Yeah,
one, active,
I've
and they're
done
like,
piano,
oh,
I've
just
done
looking for tech writers.
Merching's different.
Like,
And there's
so,
and there's nobody to riff with, right?
yeah.
Yeah, it's tough.
Well, it's kind of like, if I'm not lazy and I walk over to the other building, he's usually full of ideas, so
Yeah,
I
unfortunately.
wanna walk.
Do you Slack?
No,
This month.
Microsoft Teams, I don't like it as much.
You might just want to fire up a
So,
channel of writers on.
Yeah. this
I think
was-
we should, because I find some of the other tech writers are a bit less social butterflies, but I like.
And I really enjoyed.
Every time I ask
They looked
our
at
teams,
recipes
like,
and
hey, what do you think I should do?
totally different.
Or if I send them the article, like, how did I write it? What do you think?
Fun.
They end up like
Like they
rewriting.
topic, which was
You know, like
automatically
it's so hard to like get in, and they don't know the product either. So
There's always content to build.
So
But
That's
collaboration,
fine.
team
One,
writers,
two,
team writers
check.
doesn't seem to work very well.
I have no reviewers, that is the one.
No one.
thing
Does anyone have reviewers? What's it used? If yours is
I just get one of the other
Not
courses.
copywriting, it's just-
Well, thanks for coming out, folks.
Depending on.
go off your bed, do the edits.
We sure do appreciate it. It's awesome to see so many people come in month to month and see that number picking up. I think we're close to like, we have 450 people in this meetup group now, which is pretty great. And I was just in Portland along with Drew, who's also one of our regular members, and at Write the Docs. And we went to a couple of the meetup organizer groups. So it's a chance for the meetup organizers to get together and chat about meetups and stuff. And yeah, I guess I was a little bit surprised to find out we're one of the bigger meetups now. So that's pretty cool. And we're doing a lot of neat things here with everyone's, with all your involvement and you guys coming out and everything. We're doing a lot of really cool stuff that people were interested to hear about, like the on conferences and the lightning talks and different kind of formats. Everyone's really interested to know about like, how do you get people to come out to meetups? How do you engage with people? How do you have like a engaged group of people that come out? And it seems like we've somehow been able to do that in this group. So yeah, I'm really appreciative of that. And I think it's really awesome. So yeah, I think you guys should give yourselves a round of applause. Yay! Yay for us! Yay for you guys! So yeah, I mentioned earlier we have a Slack. The Write the Docs has a Slack, which is awesome. It's a great fountain of information to join. So if you haven't joined it yet, you can get in there. And we have a channel in there, which is, I think it's called Ottawa. So we can communicate in there about different things. I posted a link to our YouTube channel, which I believe has. What's the running total on that now, Jeff? 4?
Sorry.
Jeff's in charge of the YouTube channel. I don't think he knows that yet, but.
Sorry, you're at a hard 2.
Oh, we're still at 2, eh? Oh man. So we have 2 subscribers. So consider subscribing to the YouTube channel. And we do have handles now on social media, like for Twitter and Instagram and stuff. Twitter is the one I started to notice that some of our posts are getting liked and stuff by other people in the Write the Docs community, which is pretty cool. So yeah, consider if you do any kind of Twitter stuff, consider following us on there. You can get your Wi-Fi at Shopify Guests. Password welcome to Shopify. And there's bathrooms just around the corner. There's some fobs on that chair over there. So if you do need to go out to use the bathroom, you'll need to use the fob to get back in. And I thought I would just give you a little run through of my experience in Portland last week before we get into our main event. We're super lucky to have Andy Etter with us tonight. Who's going to give us what I think is going to be a really interesting talk. And before we jump into that, I'm just going to go over a couple of things that I thought were kind of neat. So Eric Holscher, who is, I guess, kind of the person that started all of this craziness 7 years ago, gave his intro talk, kind of the state of Write the Docs. And he underscored about how this community is kind of all about finding identity and ownership, taking ownership and having pride as a person that cares about documentation. I was just skimming through my copy of Andy's book, and there's some really great quotes in there, and one of them that I think is really in line with that. Great documentation makes new hires productive in days instead of weeks, prevents thousands of calls to customer support, is the difference between crippling downtime and rock solid stability, and inspires true fervent love of development platforms. Technical writing matters, so I wrote this book to help people create documentation in a sensible way. It's a great book. There's a lot of neat little quotes like that that make you want to like highlight them. If you have the Kindle or whatever app you're using, so you can go back to them later. So that is kind of what Write the Docs means to me. Every year I go there, it always feels really special. I always get that same feeling of connecting with the community. And isn't it great that people do care about docs? Because I think sometimes in our day-to-day jobs, working with other folks that have other priorities and whatnot, maybe that it's easy to lose sight of that. So I always feel really motivated and fired up every time I come back. Can't you tell? And Drew is there. You're seeing my my speaker notes because I wasn't able to figure out how to make the speaker thing work. So it was really cool to see somebody else from our Write the Docs meetup there in Portland. I thought that was really neat. And I was also surprised to find out that there's actually 42 meetups now on 5 continents. So there's meetups in China now. There's meetups in South Korea. There's a big presence in Australia. There is a conference coming up actually in Vilnius in Lithuania. I believe it's actually next week. So one of the neat things about Write the Docs this year was that they streamed the conference, so you could actually like watch it on YouTube in real time. And I think they're going to be also doing that for the Vilnius conference. So consider checking out the conference page, and I'm sure you can find some information to get to the live stream if you want to watch the talks. One of the things I find about conferences is that I often say, oh yeah, the talks are on YouTube, so I'll just watch them later. And you click that like watch later button, and it just adds to that list of 6,000 videos that you want to watch later. Does anyone else have that problem? Yeah. It's like I'm really interested in watching things later. But I don't really get to it. So I think that's one of the reasons why I think attending is kind of neat, because you actually do go and like you do actually like stick your eyeballs on a stage and watch someone talking. And it also is kind of a good excuse to put your phone down and just kind of be engaged with something and think about things. So I thought that was cool. So maybe the live stream is like sort of another, if you can't go all the way to Lithuania on a plane, you could like live stream what they're doing in Lithuania. And maybe that would be cool. A couple other things that were kind of neat is that they're going to be trying to do like a large scale East Coast conference. So like something similar to what they're doing in Portland or in Cincinnati, but on the East Coast. And it's really early days. So if you are interested in this community and getting involved, you can go onto the Write the Docs Slack and you can reach out and say, hey, I want to get involved with the East Coast conference. And then maybe you too could wear one of those really cool yellow lanyards that all of the organizers wear at the conference. And you also get a Write the Docs hoodie, which as far as I know, only organizers get those. And I really want one, but I'm not an organizer yet. So who knows, maybe this is my chance. And maybe it's your chance if you want to get involved. And they're even getting into regional ambassadors, which are paid roles. So the organization is definitely taking off worldwide, and it's really growing. And one of the things Eric mentioned was that it would be cool to maybe create some more artifacts for this community, things like style guides and linting tools and things like that. So if that's something that interests you, if you're into linters or documentation or writing a style guide for Write the Docs, this would be a good time to jump in and do that. So real quick before we jump into our talk with Andy, a couple of talks that I thought were really awesome. One was by Matt Rainier called Show Me the Money, which is how to get your docs the love and support they deserve. So this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about wanting to kind of increase the exposure of documentation underscore the value of documentation. This was like a really masterful talk, which was all about like, who are all the different people in your organization that sort of like touch on docs or may kind of care about docs, and how can you talk to them? How can you talk to them about documentation in a way that they're going to care about? So you went through like pretty much, you know, all the different product lines that you might have to deal with in an organization, like sales and marketing, and kind of putting on your sales hat or your marketing hat when you're talking to those folks to be the best kind of ambassador for your project that you can be. And there's also really, one of the themes I thought actually this year with the docs was that there was a lot of emphasis on like drawing and how you can use pictures and diagrams to help out with your technical documentation, which I thought was super interesting because I draw a lot of dinosaurs with my son who's 5, and I just kind of copy them out of a book. But it made me realize that drawing is fun, like lines and connections and stuff. It's a lot like drawing like a technical diagram of how things fit together. And Alicia presented about this really neat markdown-based tool called, oh, I didn't even write it down, so now I'm not going to remember what it is. I'll think about it and I'll let you know what it's called. It's like Mermaid, that's what it is, Mermaid. It's got a nifty title. So Mermaid is this thing that you can generate diagrams using like a markdown-based language essentially. And then you can kind of plug in whatever kind of CSS or visual kind of assets that you need to it. And what's really neat about this is that it means that you can put your diagrams into version control. And when you need to update something, you can just go in and change a couple of lines of code, and that'll like add a connection or remove a connection, or add a label or remove a label. Like the way we do diagrams now on my team, the API diagrams, is that we have one person on our team who kind of wears that hat, the diagramming hat. And like, if I want to update a diagram, I have to like ping him in Slack and be like, oh, hey, can you go into whatever design tool you're using and make this update? And it might take a couple of days or whatever. But if I could just go pull down some code from GitHub and change a few lines of code and update a diagram, that would be great for everybody. Be a real time saver. So that was another one that I thought was worth checking in. So real quick, oh yeah, maybe I can go back into full screen mode. I had to like trade in my laptop right before I went to write the docs. So I had like a totally blank laptop. And one of the great things about going to the conference, maybe the main reason I go is so that I can get new stickers. So I got a bunch of cool technical writing related stickers. And it's in a music venue, which I'm a huge music fan. Music's a big deal in my life. So it's kind of a dream for me because like everyone has played at the Crystal Ballroom in Portland, like Tina Turner, the Grateful Dead. I mean, the list goes on. And they have like posters all over the walls of all the shows that have been there. So I spent a lot of the time just taking pictures with my camera. There's also a brewery inside the Crystal Ballroom where they make their own beers. You can see that on the left. And right on the other side of that wall is Lola's room, where they have the unconference and where they have the like what do they call it, reception on Sunday night, which is kind of the kicking off point of the conference. And so you get to drink a lot of tasty beer that they make on premises. That's a really well-known restaurant just down the street from Crystal Ballroom called Jake's. And then there's a picture of Eric talking about the atmosphere we aim for, which is all about being welcoming and open and supportive and positive, that's the best. You know, how can you not feel great when you're in a room where everyone feels that way? And then there's somebody that mentioned Tom Petty on one of their slides, which was a big deal for me. So I included the slide. And there's Matt giving his talk about talking to other teams. And there's Alicia giving her talk about Mermaid. All right, cool. So that is a wrap for me. And we're gonna go over to Andrew. So I'm so happy to have Andrew here. I've known this book for a few years now. And it's a really quick read, but it just kind of puts down a lot of like really like sound kind of fundamental advice about what I think it means to be a technical writer, at least in software, writing about APIs and that sort of thing. So Andrew works at Amazon, and he's currently working on the Amazon Web Services project, I believe. And his book is called Modern Technical Writing. And I recommend that you seek it out on Amazon, where it's available for sale. And before that, he was at Palantir, which is a company I keep hearing about. So at a certain point, I'm gonna have to figure out what it is they do, because it seems like they must do a decent job of it. And Andrew likes to use lightweight markup and static type generators to create easy to maintain software documentation. And he likes a lot of really cool tools like Markdown and restructured texts, Jekyll and Sphinx. I wish I had the opportunity to work with restructured text and Sphinx. I feel like I should just like become a Python developer or something, so that I can do that. All right, so today Andrew's going to talk to us about speed writing for speed reading. So it's all going to be all about how do we produce and consume technical documentation? What do we know about human behavior, and what real-time strategy games can teach us about publishing and how refrigerators relate to the ultimate reader experience? And apparently metaphors abound, so I'm pretty stoked for that. So Andrew, are you on the line there with us?
Yeah, let me actually fire up my camera and my mic. Am I coming through okay?
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear.
Awesome. Let me adjust this as well.
So I'm going to stop.
And I think I'll just steal the screen from you if I can.
Yeah, I just stopped sharing, and if I go over here, I can go down here.
You're up to 4 subscribers.
Woohoo! Alrighty, so you got your screen, you're presenting.
I think I've got control. The interesting thing about this talk maybe is that I have to go full screen so you can see the slides, which means if there are any like hands waving in the audience, I won't be able to see you. So I'll try to insert like 5-second pregnant pauses during the presentation during which you can interject if there are any questions or anything.
One thing I was thinking that after you give your talk, I'll go ahead and put you back on full screen again, and that way we can all see your big face in the room, and you'll be able to see us. So
I don't think anybody wants that first part.
That might be a good chance for more extended dialogue if we need to do that.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, I guess I'll just jump right in. I think we're a little bit time constrained, so I want to just get right to it. First, a huge thank you to everybody for coming tonight. This is my first international presentation, so I'm incredibly excited. Finally branching out beyond the US.
Bravo.
And tonight's talk is maybe my least focused ever, so I apologize for that up front, but I think the fun part about it is it contains a little bit of everything. So let's just jump right in. I don't want to spend too much time talking about who I am because I just got such a kind introduction from Andrew. I've worked in the software industry for about 12 years now, though, in a variety of different roles. And I currently work at Amazon Web Services, where I specialize in search and analytics. And on New Year's Day 2016, I published this book, Modern Technical Writing, in which I advocate for basically what amounts to an open source approach to documentation. And there's a ton of overlap between my book here and the principles that Write the Docs has been espousing for years. So anytime I get a chance to talk to folks at Write the Docs, I pretty much jump at it. Really quickly about the book is only about 11,000 words. I think most people run through it in a little under an hour. But if that's still too long for you, don't worry. I've distilled it down to about 12 words here for everybody. Let's just run through these really quickly. When I mention this word learn right at the top, this is me pushing back against the notion that technical writers are scribes or editors, that technical writers just take content from engineers or subject matter experts and sort of transform it and clean it up and then pass it back to them for review. I talked to a graduating senior recently, a university senior from, I think it was San Jose State, who was really surprised to hear this and said, oh, I thought I would be writing very little content and really just cleaning it up. And I had to kind of dispel him of that illusion. The way that I do my job and the way that I sort of advocate for other people to do their jobs is to do hours and hours of testing and learning and reading. And yes, verify all of those learnings with engineers to make sure that you're on the right track. But to do it all yourself and generate your own content and become the expert on your own. These next three, writing and lightweight markup, storing in Git, and making static sites, I don't want to dwell on these too much just because they are such in the wheelhouse of Write the Docs. But the idea is that documentation should live online. It should be easy to manage. It should be versioned just like all other code, and it should be easy for people who are not technical writers to contribute to. And a big part of that contribution barrier is making sure that no matter what operating system you're on or what tools you have, that you are able to contribute, which is why I'm always banging the lightweight markup drum, because you can use any text editor you like. It doesn't matter if you're on Linux, Windows, Mac OS, maybe even iOS. And this last one, iterating, when I say this, I mean to get documentation out into the world early and often and treat it like a working draft. Some days I publish 8 or 10 or even 20 times. And that's usually me making little tiny fixes as I work on some larger chunk of content. And as I say in the book, publishing shouldn't be a special event. It should be really trivial. It should be a couple of clicks. And if it's anything more than that, you've probably got a problem in the process. Tonight, though, the big emphasis is on points 1 and 5 here, learning and iterating. But I think I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, so let's just jump to the next slide. Many years ago, I had just gotten my bachelor's degree, and I was on my way to being a teacher. And I was pretty dissatisfied with the state of the credentialing process in California, and also really just the state of the public school system in general. And I stumbled upon this quote from somebody who I'd never heard of. This is Norman Douglas. He was born in 1868 in what is now Austria, but at the time was known as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was really, really bright and ended up getting sent away to England, where he got a first-rate education. And aside from a brief, almost disastrous stint in government service, he made his living as a writer. And throughout his adult life, he lived in St. Petersburg, London, Florence, Naples, French Riviera, and the Italian island of Capri. And here in 2019, we've been given so many examples of why it is not good to learn too much about people that we admire. And sure enough, Norman Douglas had a particularly despicable trait that we are going to ignore today. In 1917, Douglas published his most famous work, the novel South Wind. At the time, it was an immediate hit, and today far, far less popular. I think very few people have heard of it. But the book and really Douglas's prose are extraordinary. I can't overstate it. He's vivid and eloquent and self-aware and funny. He's got this absolute full command of the language, but it still never feels showy. He's always got the right word for the right sentence. And one prominent encyclopedia called his prose somewhat near the perfection of the conversational style. In 1952, Douglas died here on the Italian island of Capri. He was 83 years old, and when the Catholic Sisters of Mercy came to revive him, his last words were, and I hope you'll pardon my French, "Get those effing nuns away from me." The man, as we saw earlier and just now, he's truly eminently quotable, and we will hear from him a couple more times tonight. I mainly bring up Capri because A, it's very pretty, but also the novel South Wind takes place on the island. I'm going to talk about a book within a book here, so stick with me, okay? Early in South Wind, a character named Ernest Eames gets his hands on a 900-page history book about the island. Eames reads this book 3 times, back to back to back. He is just enamored with it. And he's so enamored with it that he makes it his life work to bring the book, which I should mention is 200 years old and written in Latin, up to date. He wants to add appendices, footnotes, and illustrations. This is a real labor of love for Eames. And I think we all know somebody like Eames, somebody who pours themselves into their studies with a really rigorous scholarly attitude. They don't rush. They almost savor every sentence as they read. These people kind of remind me of glaciers, where the speed of movement is really imperceptible, but there's no stopping them. And my aunt is like this. She has several postgraduate degrees, and she worked for some really prominent universities here in the United States. And to this day, her house has stacks and stacks of books that she doesn't have room for on the shelves, and so they're just shoved into a corner. And she's published several papers as well that I'm confident that at time of writing were really rigorously researched and completely up to date and accurate. People like my aunt, people like Eames, they don't view a 900-page Latin manuscript as a hassle. It's a challenge, maybe even a treasure. Unfortunately for humanity, most people are not like Mr. Eames. Most people are not like my aunt. In fact, most of my aunts are not like my aunt. Most people, they read something once or twice, and if it doesn't resonate with them or it doesn't make sense, they just don't get it, it's more complicated than they thought, they either start blindly experimenting, maybe they look for another resource, or maybe they just give up. Case in point, I just spent a non-trivial amount of time talking about Norman Douglas and South Wind, and I've never finished the damn book. I once, I know, right? I once made it halfway. The critical point here, the entire reason that I bring it up is that this is a great book from a great writer. In documentation, we're trying to convince people to read something of unknown quality from an unknown writer. And instead of a book, which everybody knows is meant to be read start to finish in your favorite easy chair, documentation is read piecemeal, and the entry point can be any one of hundreds of web pages. But of course, you could say, well, this divide between normal people and scholars, like Andy, that's just garbage. It's just your opinion. Where's your evidence? What do you got? To which I applaud you, because most smart, curious people that I've encountered, they've learned over time not to over-index on their opinions because they remember all those times in their lives when research overturned their misconceptions. But the thing is, we don't have to guess. In fact, I've got a little bit of evidence to share. We have numbers. These are numbers that I pulled from a large, prominent set of documentation, and I averaged them against two other sets. And I suspect if you've ever looked at the numbers on your own documentation, they probably look very similar. So we have metrics that indicate that millions and millions of people read documentation. But they don't read it in the traditional sense of the word. They certainly don't read it front to back. They scan it until they find something that looks interesting, and then they read that. Now, this usage pattern shouldn't really come as a surprise to anybody. We all do it. We all do it every day. But yet, I would argue that we're hypocritical, myself included, if we don't keep it in mind as we author our content. The most credible subject I could find on this said that fluent English speakers can get through about 220 words per minute when they're reading, meaning that most people would need several hours to read any one of my guides cover to cover. And if I'm lucky, I've got 5 minutes. So when I see documentation that looks like this, I gotta tell you, I stop caring about clear, concise, correct, and complete. I don't care about language and accuracy, and I don't care if it conforms to the Chicago Manual of Style to a T. I get really, really concerned because it's not written for the way that people read. It's not written for the web. So instead of talking about humanity, which is maybe a little bit too broad, let's talk about our readers. And in case it's not evident on the screen, I want to emphasize this category here is not the undeserved, it is the underserved. This group consists of people who don't have the foundational knowledge to interface with our content. It's not our job to teach people how to turn on a computer, open a web browser, operate a trackpad. We're not responsible for explaining the differences between Bash and PowerShell or Python 2 and 3 or why REST APIs are so popular. Comprehensive documentation, I would argue, is vastly overrated and not the goal. And unfortunately, we can't target scholars either. We can't target people like my aunt because we're never going to write at a level of detail that they're happy with. Scholars are better off picking up a 1,700-page copy of Learning Python than they are reading the Python documentation online. These are people who want the reasoning and philosophy behind important design decisions. They want a history of the programming language, comparisons to other languages, biographies of the developers maybe, and a whole lot more. We can offer reference materials as a sort of olive branch to scholars, but they're really not our audience either. Technical writers, I think, are really kind, empathetic people by nature. I mean, I think we all got into this profession to teach people and share. But we have to be careful to keep those dividing lines in the right spots. We have to keep them in reasonable locations. If we start pushing them too far out in an attempt to widen our audience, typically we end up with the sort of bloated, overwritten, self-evident content that prevents people from scanning and frustrates pretty much every reader. I know it's not the nicest sentiment in the world, but we just have to accept that we can't help some number of the people who come to the docs. And what that leaves us with is kind of the sweet spot. These are people who have the foundational knowledge to make progress. They manage to find our content. They want to learn more, and they don't have the attention span to read an entire page, much less every page in order. This is our audience. These are the people we can help. So one of the things that annoys me whenever we get to, sort of something we can all agree on. I don't know if people are actually agreeing in the audience, but when we get to something that I hope that we can all agree on is people to sort of hand wave it all away and say, so write to that audience without offering any real concrete, easy to do things. So here's my giant list, because really no PowerPoint presentation would be complete without a large bulleted list. I'm only going to run through a couple of these. One of the big ones that I see a lot of people nowadays neglecting is search, and having documentation, having it in a web form, but having a subpar search experience. And here and today, I would argue that any search that you're implementing on your documentation needs a flavor of autocomplete. If you look at Google back when it launched versus the Google experience today, it's so different, having Google automatically complete phrases for you and suggest what you should be looking for next. And we should all be striving for that in the docs as well. It's a huge boost in usability. For me, I really argue about inverting the typical way in which documentation is written, where documentation might start with a conceptual overview and then some steps on a feature, and then maybe a table, a reference table or something, and then finally a code sample at the very bottom. I want to see that flipped. I want to see, why would I ever use this feature right at the top of the page, and then the code sample immediately after that. And then sure, we can get into the explanation of what's going on there. But emphasizing examples is so huge in creating quality documentation and making docs easy to consume and quick to consume. I see a lot of old school writers who have some terrible bias against sentence fragments, as if like a sentence fragment suddenly just destroys your credibility in the documentation or something. Given that they shorten your sentences and let you get to the meat of your content more quickly, I have no problem with including them as appropriate, as long as you're not overdoing it. And this last one is another pet peeve of mine, where I think a lot of information architects out there in the world want to have a really robust taxonomy, and they want to have everything under its proper category. And so you end up with this like horrible nested mess where it takes you like 8 +sign expansions to get to the content you're actually looking for. I would argue, I think most people would agree that documentation should probably have at minimum 2 levels of nested navigation. But I would go further and say at maximum it should have 3. And 2 is really kind of the sweet spot. So flattening out your structure, I think, can also make an incredible difference in how easy your documentation is to scan and consume. So far, this has been a fairly, I guess, literary talk. So let's transition into something a little bit less literary. In 1998, a company down in Irvine, California, released a PC game called StarCraft. You've probably heard of the company. Blizzard are the same people who are behind World of Warcraft and Overwatch. At the time, StarCraft went on to sell about 10 million copies. And the premise is a lot like the film Starship Troopers, if you've ever seen that. It's space marines fighting space bugs, fighting, you guessed it, space aliens. StarCraft belongs to a genre of games called real-time strategy. And by real time, we mean that unlike chess, where you and your opponent take turns, you don't take turns. You simultaneously do everything. So you simultaneously gather up resources, build bases, train armies, and move them around the map. The other kind of fundamental feature of a game like StarCraft is called the fog of war. What this means is that you cannot see what your opponent is doing unless your army has vision of that area of the map. In other words, you have to send out units to scout. You can see there, I know it's probably a little bit hard to see in the lower left, there are these little pockets of light amidst the fog. And what this means is in a game like this, you're always operating off of incomplete information. And so when I first played StarCraft, when I first got into it back in '98, I found it really relaxing. I would make a bunch of defensive structures, I would train a couple of units, I'd move around the map, and then almost all the time I would lose. And then in 2002, I stumbled across some footage of professionals playing the game. And if you've never seen this footage, I would encourage you, check it out on YouTube, although it's so fast, you might get a bit of a headache. The level of multitasking and near constant scouting that these professionals were doing were so different from what I was doing that we might as well have been playing different games. They seemed to be just everywhere at once, and yet they would still have games where they got caught completely by surprise. And after seeing how the game was played at a high level, I got pretty good at StarCraft. And if I had to summarize the key skill in the game, it's the ability to make good decisions based off of experience and limited information. And that sentence, the ability to make good decisions based off of experience and limited information, that's not just a StarCraft skill, that's a life skill. It's certainly a documentation skill. So let's consider a really quick scenario. This happened a few months ago. I was out to lunch with one of the product managers on my team, and he complained that he'd been on the phone with 2 customers that week, and both of them were really cost sensitive and were making every attempt to minimize data storage. I got back to my desk after lunch and I took a peek at the metrics, and sure enough, the backups page, which uses cheap storage, was very, very popular. And very few people were making use of multiple replicas, which used expensive storage. With some Googling, I found a thread on Stack Overflow that had a popular CLI that a lot of people were using to delete data. The top answer had a bunch of upvotes, so I felt good about that. And I played with the CLI for, I don't know, an hour maybe, wrote up a little bit of documentation, and hit publish. So in this example, and I guess like in life, I suppose, I don't really know anything. I didn't talk to any users to verify what the PM said. I looked at metrics for all of 30 seconds. I did a Google search and scanned a couple links, and then I did some testing and published it. The whole process was like 2 hours, start to finish, I would say. So I guess the question here is, should I have called up several users and performed deep dives into their use cases? Should I have performed, I don't know, extensive analysis and sent those conclusions off to my peers so that they could validate them? How many tools for doing this exist anyway? Are there 5 different ones? Did I write about all of them? How do I pick the most popular one? Do we have one that we're developing in-house here at Amazon? Or I guess if we don't, why don't we? Should I advocate for that instead? In general, as a company, do we even want to talk about third-party tools? I guess why or why not? Or the route that I took, which was don't worry about that and just hit publish. And based on my experience, an anecdote, a little bit of testing, and some metrics, it's probably a good decision. And if it's not, it's really easy to undo. I have a colleague over at Amazon who some people might have heard of, Tom Johnston. He's maybe the most prolific blogger in the entire tech writing community. He calls this the second chance point strategy, which I gotta say, Tom, not a term that I love, but we'll go with it for now. What he means is that in basketball terms, you follow your shot. After you shoot in case you miss, you run up to the hoop and you try to grab the rebound. In StarCraft terms, this is making a decision and then continuing to scout in case you missed something. And in documentation, it means making a change and then keeping a really close eye on reader feedback and metrics to see whether or not you messed up. So whatever analogy you want to use, the idea is to make your best guess based on insight and information, measure, repeat, and don't be afraid of undoing things. If you're using Git, which I would argue pretty much everybody should be, a revert is something like 2 commands. And it doesn't mean that your efforts were a failure at all. Bare minimum, you learned something. Of course, this strategy of mine relies on you having a really, really tight feedback loop. You have to have these rich metrics. You need to provide an easy way for readers to report documentation bugs, and you need to be able to publish whenever you want. In other words, your content needs to be on the web, and ideally it should be open source. And I occasionally have people tell me that I put too much of an emphasis on tools. They say, oh, I want generalizable documentation strategies. You're too focused on tools. But frankly, I think they're missing the point. If I have to use Adobe FrameMaker and I can only publish PDFs twice a year, I can't use this strategy. I have to work in a completely different, much more meticulous, laborious, methodical way that doesn't rely on such a tight feedback loop and easy publishing process. To me, it's very much the difference between giving a logger a hacksaw versus a chainsaw. The entire job changes for that person, even if the end result is still people walking out of Home Depot with a bunch of 2x4s. So many of the things that I advocate for, you can't do, or at least you can't do efficiently unless you're using modern tools, which is why I keep, as I said earlier, kind of banging that drum. This is my crude graph of documentation quality over time. And what I'm trying to convey here is that if you have a tight feedback loop and you bias towards lots and lots of quick changes without too much research, I think you end up with something like this. The top line here represents numerous good decisions over time with a number of flubs, whereas the bottom is a more measured approach that relies on doing tons and tons of research before publishing an improvement. And you can see that the top line, like the stock market, does have those dips in quality that represent mistakes and missteps inherent in the lots of good decisions approach to documentation. But I would argue that it still produces a higher quality set of documentation over time, even with those missteps. And in the software industry, we've realized this a long time ago, that the only way to arrive at a great product is to get a decent product out the door and then iterate relentlessly over time. And really, to me, documentation is no different. And further, I'd say that a lot of writers are really, really hesitant to make a change because they have this misconception that it's somehow set in stone. Some decisions are indeed really, really hard to unmake. At Amazon, we call those one-way doors. But content in a set of documentation on the web, that's not a one-way door at all. You can go back through anytime you want, undo away. So my challenge to everybody here is to go into work tomorrow and delete something you've always wanted to delete. Try looking at the, I don't know, at the troubleshooting section if you're struggling to find some content worth deleting. And after you do that, see if anybody complains. And if they do, no problem. Just apologize and revert, or maybe take the little chunk of content they cared about and move it somewhere else. It's really not the end of the world if somebody complains about it. And in fact, I'd argue it's the beginning of a better set of documentation. Finally, let's talk about the nature of reader feedback. Like I said earlier, I really, really do believe that technical writers are kind, empathetic people by nature. And so some of us, myself included, can take feedback a little bit too personally. And I get it completely, because 99% of the feedback we receive comes in the form of complaints and bugs and angry messages from frustrated people who weren't able to get where they were going, or rather where they wanted to go. And unfortunately, if you're looking for tons of day-to-day positive reinforcement and recognition, I think you've probably chosen the wrong career. My paradoxical message of hope, however, is that for each one of those frustrated readers, you have hundreds of people who read the documentation, got the information they needed, and never gave you a second thought. And I know that probably sounds weird, but that's why I get out of bed in the morning. That's the reason I love my job. It's certainly not tweaking my content to better conform to the style guide, or projecting credibility and enhancing Amazon's worldwide brand, or certainly not catching a stray grocer's apostrophe or something. The reason I tie my shoes and go to work every morning is for all those people in the world who are just looking to accomplish something. Maybe their bosses are jerks, or they have a tight deadline, and they can go to the documentation, get an answer, and close the tab. Maybe they think to themselves, wow, that was really, really helpful. But ideally, in my mind, they don't think at all. I want people to leave work, go home, and when their significant others ask over dinner, hey, how was your day? They say, oh yeah, I stood up a new Elasticsearch cluster and I'm ingesting my application logs. It was pretty easy. How was your day? So in my ideal world, the sort of content that I try to write, the sort of documentation I try to produce, I want people to think about what I've written and what I've put out there in the world about as often as they think about their refrigerators. Thanks very much. So I haven't looked at the clock at all, but I am hopeful that we have a lot of time for questions.
You're pretty much dead on 30 minutes there. So perfectly executed talk.
All right, that's what I like to hear.
Now I'm wondering if we can just get your face up on the screen so we can talk to you.
Sure, I will stop sharing to see if that helps.
Yeah. Oh, there you are.
All right.
Mamie, there's also some other microphones in the closet over there on the top right. So if people have questions, the mics help to kind of reinforce the sound a little bit. Yeah, you just have to click them on and they should all be working. Yeah. So if anyone has any questions for Andrew, just stick up your hand and we'll bring a microphone over to you. Because otherwise I'll just ask him like 7 questions.
I'll start.
Yeah, we got Drew.
Oh, sorry.
And then Jeff.
Is it on? Yeah. Okay. So with your fast iteration approach, have you seen that being used successfully in an environment where there were localization requirements, where the documentation had to go through some kind of translation?
Yeah, actually, we do the same thing at AWS, where content gets picked up only every week or two to be localized. And I guess a lot of people view it as some sort of huge failure, but I don't think it's a big deal for the English content to sort of race ahead of other content by a week or two and just have the localized versions catch up. But I suppose it would depend on your environment and the kind of company you're at and the kind of clients you have.
Right, okay.
Sorry, if I could just add a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Do you find your translation costs are rather expensive compared to most other models when you use that model?
I honestly don't have any insight into the costs of our translation. It's another team that handles all of the localization work. I suspect that we just have them on some sort of retainer, or maybe we have some in-house people. I guess I could see it being a little more expensive, but I don't know that I have enough insight to make any real concrete statement around it.
Okay, thanks. I have one more question, and I'll leave you alone. I'm really intrigued by your approach, and I really want to use it myself. My problem is I can't afford to be wrong. I write for doctors. People get hurt. People get hurt if I'm wrong. But instead of just walking away from the same, the stakes are too high for me with my content. Do you have any suggestions how I might be able to use your approach, but have some sort of fail safes in place to make sure that tragic errors don't get shipped?
Yeah, I had somebody bring this up the last time that I gave this talk, and it was that exact same thing. It was saying, listen, I write mission critical stuff. Don't tell me about rapid iteration. And yeah, so many of the ideas that I present here are not applicable if you're doing really, really important things. The only maybe potential takeaway I can think of is to stand content up in an easy, like the exact same site, right, that you generate on Jekyll, you can also send off to an internal server. And that might make it more likely for engineers or subject matter experts or anybody else to review it internally, as opposed to firing them off a PDF via email or throwing something in Google Docs. I think giving them a web-based help system to review can be useful as well in that regard in terms of engagement. But otherwise, yeah, I think publishing out to the world, if something really is that important on my sort of schedule, is inadvisable to say the least.
Thank you.
I can follow up. I have a follow-up question to that, if you don't mind. What format do you use for feedback on the web-based publishing tools? Because I've had trouble with that in the past, where the tool that I was using didn't have a way for people to get back to me, and so therefore people found it more complicated than looking at a PDF where they could just comment in line.
Sure. For the internal content at Amazon, we use a really it's a customized flavor doc book that I don't recommend for anybody. But for the open source content, it's a whole lot easier because content is in Markdown, and we're using GitHub for a lot of it. And so the engagement model there is pretty simple, where people can just literally click in. It's a web UI, and they can just say, like, I have a problem with this one line of your pull request, or leave a more complete review. So yeah, I don't want to just keep saying like GitHub, but it does solve a lot of problems, especially when engaging with developers.
And Richard's got a question over here.
I have a couple of questions. One is, what metrics do you use to measure good quality documentation? And the other one is videos. We're hearing a lot of users prefer videos over documentation. Do you have any comment on that?
Sure. Let me address the video question first. Videos are, I think people have this misconception that videos are hard to make. I actually think videos are very, very easy to make, but they're very hard to maintain over time. And that's I think the fundamental problem here is, if something is a tutorial that you expect will stay relatively static over the life of a product, then by all means make a video, because some people do learn better that way. If you're trying to introduce people to like the advanced features of an API or something like that you know is going to change under the hood over time, then I think videos really don't make a lot of sense. So it's about picking your battles, and I think thinking videos as more supplemental content as opposed to core content. Regarding the metrics, let me pull up another presentation I have so I can just read from it, because I do actually, I thought about this problem a lot, that if I couldn't read a set of documentation, if I just had to look at some metrics, how would I tell myself whether or not this was of high quality? And so let me see what the heck criteria I came up with, since I don't have them off the top of my head, of course. If it comes up, let's see. Oh my gosh. Okay. I can tell you, at least for me, I was really, really focused, and I always have been on really fast bug resolution and keeping that bug count low over time. So this again relates back to reader feedback, right? Where if you are getting feedback, making sure that you're addressing those as they come in and not letting them pile up. I also look at whether or not reader engagement on the documentation matches engagement on the product. So for example, if you have a product that over the course of 3 months becomes 10 times more popular, I would have an expectation that the documentation would become some number of times more popular as well. If the product gets 10x more popular and docs dip in engagement down by like 50%, that to me is a massive alarm bell that probably needs to be investigated. And if that were going on, I might not say the docs were going great. Documentation should remediate common support issues. And so if you can have the support team categorize their tickets and say, hey, most people who call us run into this, this, and this, and you can just point to the documentation and say, oh yeah, I address all of those, that's a great sign. And also, again, going back to search from earlier, your top search terms need to return relevant results. And that's manual testing that you can do on your end to make sure that when you punch in a search term, it's getting you to a helpful page.
Yeah, I sort of have a follow-up question to it's Richard. Richard, what Richard was asking. So I've been thinking a lot about metrics. I saw this really great talk at Read the Docs last year from Kat King about how they're doing quality metrics at Twilio. And it was pretty interesting because it was sort of this idea that you could kind of come up with a way of measuring the docs, which is something that I think like everyone's kind of struggling with that. And we kind of came up with an approach that's similar to how Twilio is doing, where we have a form on our site and users can leave feedback there, and I think they can leave a score, and then they can also leave some qualitative feedback as well, like what did they like about it or what did they not like about it. And then we have as of last week, we have a dashboard now where we can kind of roll up all of that feedback in a kind of easily sliceable and diceable manner. But my concern there, and this kind of goes to what you were saying earlier in your talk, was that like we kind of want to drive people to a point where they don't give us a second thought, and they kind of just go off and they're happy. And so if we're not getting a lot of that feedback, and we're getting a lot of the feedback from these outlier people that are, they're so pissed off they're actually going to write something. Totally. And it's hard for me in good conscience as like a team leader to sort of say this is your metric that you have to live or die by, right? And so I'm like, how do we build up a metric that is a bit more realistic than that? Are there other inputs that we can use? Do you have any kind of best practices or ideas of how we can build up a more balanced metric for that?
I hope so. Let me try to address aspects of that. For me, documentation metrics in isolation aren't super useful. So if you tell me like average time on page is 45 seconds or something, or we got 20,000 views last week, I don't know if that's good or bad. I don't really even especially care. What I care about are those same documentation metrics in relation to product metrics and in relation to support metrics. And so if you can compare those things and see how they relate to each other and say, hey, we got 100,000 views of the docs and only 4 support tickets last week, that feels like a pretty good week. That feels pretty successful in a way that just 100,000 documentation page views doesn't. So I would try thinking about it in a more comparative way as opposed to just an absolute way.
That's interesting. So you're sort of saying like, how many views did the docs get in a given time period versus how many bugs concerning the docs were open?
Let's say the product had 700 bugs reported on it last month by customers, and yet the documentation only had 3 bugs reported on it. That feels like a success story for the documentation in a way that 3 bugs previously might not have. And so I guess that's what I mean is looking at those 3 areas, documentation metrics, support metrics, and product metrics, and seeing where you're strong and where you're weak.
And so you actually have a way that you can kind of get a view into like all of the bugs for AWS or
for my particular service, yes, not for all of AWS.
Okay, right, yeah.
Support tickets are a little harder to come by. I usually have to get the team to prepare like a little report for me since they refuse to give me access to the tickets themselves.
Right. Yeah, I love that. I'm just trying to think about how we would figure that out at Shopify.
Yeah. I have to be a little bit vague about it because I never know what product metrics and what support metrics a company is actually measuring. And so I just have to say, like, go to those teams and get them and see what's available and then bounce it off your own numbers.
Yeah, I think one of the quotes from your book that I really liked was about, tracking over time that the bugs that were reported by users, bugs and inaccuracies, and then saying that we solve those within a certain amount of time. Like I think in the book you said we resolve those within 72 hours. So that's something that we're hoping to put together. Was there any other questions from the audience? I have one more.
Okay, I can probably do one more. I have a pretty hard stop.
Oh yeah, right. You've got a hard stop at 7:15. Okay,
yeah, you're good. Yeah.
All right, last question. So I noticed in the beginning of your book, you mentioned something that you figured that the book would have a shelf life of about 5 years.
Yeah.
And so I think we're about 3 years in now, and I was just wondering how do you think things are going, and do you have any plans for a second edition?
Yeah, I'm actually fairly happy with how the book has aged, but I have to confess as well that I cheated. When I say that I cheated, I've probably updated it 30 times since I published it.
Oh, okay.
And so if I hadn't done that, it would probably be getting much more stale and have much less value over time. But that's the real benefit for me in terms of only publishing an ebook as opposed to publishing a paper book, is I can do that under the hood very stealthily and keep things a little bit more up to date.
That's awesome. Cool. Well, thanks so much for being here with us tonight. Let's give a round of applause for Andrew.
Thank you so much, everybody. I really, really appreciate you all coming.
Okay, see you later. All right, folks. Well, we've got a few minutes left if you want to hang out and eat some food and whatnot. And I will just see if I can jump back into the meeting here. Join Hangouts meeting. Oh, wait a second. Is that
How did you find him,
present
the
now?
presenter?
I don't even read the book.
I don't remember. I just kind of he's someone that I've known about for a while, and I think he just kind of came up in my suggested list of contacts on LinkedIn or something.
Oh, okay.
So I just connected with him, and then we were coming up with our programming for this year. And I just send a flurry of direct messages on LinkedIn to people, and I'm like, who are we gonna have this year? And whoever comes back gets to do it. So it worked out.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, I love that talk. And then I want to share this. Well, thanks, folks. There's the social handles again and the Slack community, which is a really great place. There's also a Write the Docs newsletter that is essentially like a digest of all of the discussions that go on in that community. And I highly recommend going to the Write the Docs site and signing up for that, because essentially what it does is it just kind of summarizes everything that people have been talking about within like a given month or whatever, and provides you like all the links to what people were talking about. It's just like a treasure chest basically of amazing info. So little advertisement, we're going to have another remote talk next month, June 25th, with Evelyn Wang, who's involved in API strategy, leadership, developer experience, technical content, and engagement programs. And she's going to be giving some kind of talk on content strategy and developer portals. We haven't exactly hammered out the final topic yet, but it should be something really interesting.